Injuries, injuries, injuries. That is what's been happening in the running back landscape in the first 2 weeks. Did we think it could get any worse? Well, it could. It did. Well, we just saw on Monday Night Football, saw Nick Chubb go out for the whole season. We've seen Austin Eckler get banged up. We've seen Saquon Barkley get banged up. We saw Aaron Jones also get injured. I mean, it's just getting bad out here in the streets of the running back landscape. But week in and week out, we need to start running backs. So today we're doing the top 30 running back rankings for week 3. And let's get it going. Our first running back we're going to be talking about today, of course, in our S tier is going to be CMC. When we look at CMC, he's playing on Thursday Night Football against the 49ers. He's been averaging around 24.2 fantasy points per game, and the 49ers are favored by 7+ fantasy points to the Giants. You're of course going to be starting CMC, especially in these streets, but he is in my S tier. Moving on to my A tier, I have 3 guys this week. Last week we had 6. This week we only have 3, and that's Tony Pollard, Bijan Robinson, and Derrick Henry. Tony Pollard is going up against the Arizona Cardinals. Shout out to the Arizona Cardinals for looking better than they did in week 1, but still against Arizona, Dallas is still favored by 7+ fantasy points, meaning they will be running the ball, meaning Tony Pollard will be getting his hands on the rock plenty. So he is my RB2 heading into week 3. We then move on to Bijan Robinson, who we've just been absolutely loving Bijan Robinson. I mean, we had Bijan Robinson as our RB3 coming in pre-draft. A lot of people thought we were crazy, but Bijan Robinson has been looking like everything you want a rookie running back to look like, even better. Looking even better. Going up against Detroit this week, he's been averaging 20.8 fantasy points the last 2 weeks in PPR. The thing that we need to consider against Detroit, though, is they are a little bit of the underdog by 3 to 6 fantasy points according to the books. So they might have to throw the ball a little bit more. And we haven't really seen them be able to be successful throwing the ball. So what does that mean for Bijan Robinson? The good news is he is utilized a little bit more as a 3-down workhorse. And on those passing down situations, Bijan Robinson's in there. So I have Bijan Robinson as my RB3. Then we move on to our RB4, and we have Derrick Henry against the Cleveland Browns. Like we said, we were super sorry to see what happened to Nick Chubb, but the Tennessee Titans coming into this Cleveland Browns game are a little bit underdogs. Derrick Henry's been averaging about 16.2 fantasy points per game. So the big drop off between these top 3 to Derrick Henry is pretty significant, but Derrick Henry still has to be here as our RB4 heading into week 3. We move on to our B tier, and we have Travis Etienne, Ken Walker, and Joe Mixon. Travis Etienne's going up against the Houston Texans this week, where the Jaguars are favored by more than 7+ fantasy points. He's been averaging 13.8 fantasy points the last 2 games. It's not great. We haven't seen elite level upside for Travis Etienne, but like we said, at this point, you're having to start guys with elite level upsides, and I think Travis Etienne still possesses that. We just haven't been able to see that on a week-to-week basis. So Travis Etienne here is my RB5 this week. We move on to our RB6, and that's Ken Walker versus Carolina. If you watched my video yesterday, you saw me say that I think Ken Walker is a massive sell. And I think Ken Walker is a massive sell. If I could flip him for a wide receiver in the same range, I would do it. But this week, I do have him as my RB6. Going up against the Carolina Panthers, they are projected, Seattle is projected to be a 7-point favorite, so they are going to have to run the ball. 14.6 fantasy points is what Ken Walker has averaged the last 2 weeks in PPR. So Ken Walker is my RB6. We move on to my RB7, and that's Joey Boy Mixon versus the Los Angeles Rams for the Bengals. 11.9 fantasy points is what he's been averaging the last 3 weeks. They are favored by 3 to 6 points according to the books. Shout out to Puka Nacua for, I think, making this game going to look a little tighter than possible. Is this a get-back game for this Bengals offense, who's absolutely been struggling? It's actually like even a miracle that Joe Mixon is over 10 fantasy points average the last 2 weeks. But since he is, I do have Joe Mixon here as my RB7. Moving on to my C tier, I have Josh Jacobs, Ramondre Stevenson, Jahmyr Gibbs, James Cook, and Rashad White. We go to Josh Jacobs versus Pittsburgh. The Las Vegas Raiders are underdogs here to the Pittsburgh Steelers. The spread is pretty close, but they are still underdogs. 9.5 fantasy points is what he's averaged the last 2 weeks. Just hasn't been great. The Raiders offense hasn't looked great. We've been saying Devontae Adams, Josh Jacobs, only starter quality players you can have in this offense. We need to see it going. We need to see Jimmy G get the ball going. But like we said, right now on the running back landscape, do you have a pulse? Have we seen elite level upside before? Cool. You're in our lineup. Josh Jacobs, RB8 for me this week. RB9 is going to be Ramondre Stevenson versus the New York Jets. Surprise, surprise, surprise. With Aaron Rodgers out, the Patriots are favored by 7+ fantasy points this week versus the New York Jets. Ramondre Stevenson's been averaging 14.9 fantasy points. So it is exciting for Ramondre Stevenson. Maybe this is his elite level get back on top game. But RB9 feels like the perfect spot to slap my man Ramondre Stevenson in here as the RB9. Moving on to our RB10. And this is the week. You know, I think I didn't even get to mention it when we talked about Bijan Robinson before, but it's the game of the rookie running backs. Jahmyr Gibbs versus Bijan Robinson. 10.3 fantasy points is what Jahmyr Gibbs has averaged the last 2 weeks, and that's been on pretty limited touches. I know Coach Campbell said after week 1 that Jahmyr Gibbs needed to get way more involved, and even last week he got more involved, but really not his coming out game. With David Montgomery being a little bit more banged up, we are excited about Jahmyr Gibbs this week versus Atlanta. Like I said, they are favorited this week, so throw Jahmyr Gibbs in there. One of these weeks is finally going to happen for Jahmyr Gibbs. He's going to bust out and provide elite level ceiling. You drafted him for. I like Jahmyr Gibbs this week as my RB10. My RB11 is going to be James Cook versus Washington. James Cook had a monster game last week. Now he's averaging 15.1 fantasy points over the first 2 weeks. They're going up against the Washington Commanders, favored by 7+ fantasy points. They're going to have to put the ball on the ground at the end of the game. We like some James Cook. Don't overthink this one. The volume is king here for James Cook. Moving on to our RB12, and that's going to be Rachaad White. We've been kind of wrong about Rachaad White. Last week, we weren't in on him on the start sits. We said to sit him. Looked pretty good. But week 1, we were so-so on him, and yeah, week 1 was not great for Rachaad White. 14.1 fantasy points. He's averaged the last 2 weeks. Going up against the Philadelphia Eagles defense. That is enough for us to be sitting Rachaad White, saying, whoa, hold the phone. Not a great defense here for Rachaad White. Moving on to our D tier, we have Raheem Mostert. We have DeAndre Swift. We have Kyron Williams. We have Zach Moss, and we have AJ Dillon. What a nasty tier of running backs to be putting in here together. We start off with Raheem Mostert. 19.4 fantasy points is what he's been averaging the last 2 weeks. Going up against Denver, they're favorited by 7+. I just think the ceiling isn't necessarily there compared to some of the guys ahead of him, but Raheem Mostert does get the touches, so he is here as our RB13. Our RB14 is going to be DeAndre Swift. Shout out DeAndre Swift. We started him in a bunch of leagues. I didn't start him in one league that I lost last week, and I needed him so bad. But DeAndre Swift, 14.2 fantasy points. We saw that elite level ceiling. Will Kenneth Gainwell's been marked as questionable this week, so we still need to see if he's going to play, what those splits are going to look like between the two of them. I still think DeAndre Swift cemented himself as the RB1 based on last week, but we do need to see this week versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They're favored by 7+ fantasy points. Like this for DeAndre Swift. We then move to Kyron Williams versus the Cincinnati Bengals, and they are the underdogs in this week, but Kyron Williams, low-key, has been a league winner up to this point. 22.7 fantasy points he's averaged. I think a lot of people are saying, okay, one more week, and Kyron Williams, we're having to put him in our B tier. Like I said, he is here in my D tier, but I think RB15 is a very solid spot where you don't necessarily need him as your RB1. Probably picked him up off of waivers, but he can provide that type of RB1 upside for you if he is your RB1. I do like Kyron Williams this week as my RB15. RB16, Zach Moss. We saw Zach Moss come in, get 98% of the touches last week, 20.7 fantasy points per game. We are worried what's going to happen when Jonathan Taylor comes back. Is Jonathan Taylor going to come back? But for the next 2 weeks at least, Zach Moss is looking absolutely dominant. This week going up against the Baltimore Ravens. They are the underdog. We do know Gardner Minshew is going to be the quarterback, and when we've seen very, very terrible quarterback play for the Colts before, they love to just hand the ball off to Zach Moss. So I think Zach Moss gets plenty of touches. I don't know what that upside looks like, that yards per carry looks like, but I do know Zach Moss, elite level upside here. We then move on to AJ Dillon, who AJ Dillon let us down bad last week. But we still got to put him here. I mean, when we're talking about this Packers offense, if AJ Dillon is getting the majority of the touches with Aaron Jones out, 6.5 is what he's been averaging the last few weeks, but like we said, volume's king, so slide him here in a D tier. I still think the upside's there, just needs to get a tutty or two, and it'll come back. We move on to our E tier, and the E tier this week is essentially what my C tier was last week, with just a bunch of guys. This is pretty much everyone that's healthy, and you just don't know necessarily how to rank them. We have Miles Sanders, James Conner, Brian Robinson, Josh Kelly, Alexander Madison, Jerome Ford, Dameon Pierce, Javonte Williams. We start off with Miles Sanders. 9.8 fantasy points is what he's been averaging the last 2 weeks. This Carolina Panthers offense, absolutely disgusting, and not in the good way, like a disgusting, like they've been amazing. It's just been looking really bad with Bryce Young. 9.8 fantasy points going up against Seattle this week. I don't like the matchup, but like we said, you got a pulse on a running back, RB2 this week. We then move on to James Conner, 14.3 fantasy points the last 2 weeks. James Conner versus Dallas, another terrible matchup with Micah Parsons and those boys on the Dallas Cowboys defense coming out, absolutely going to be gunslinging for my boy Josh Dobbs. So James Conner will be in. He's going to be getting a ton of volume. I think he probably finishes this week around like 10 fantasy points. That's why I have him here in my E tier. We then move on to Brian Robinson, who's the clear RB1 for the Washington Commanders, just with like legit zero upside. But even though he's had legit zero upside, he had a really big game last week, where now he's averaging 21.3 fantasy points over the first 2 weeks, going up against the Buffalo Bills defense. And Brian Robinson is someone that, if he has another good week this week, I might have to eat my words. I might have to eat crow and say, you know what, RB20 for my man B-Rob. But like I said, pretty much if you have any of these guys healthy, you're starting them. But I just want to give you guys kind of a perception of where I view these guys coming into this week. RB21 is going to be Josh Kelly versus Minnesota. It's a very close spread here for the Minnesota versus the Chargers. So we do have Josh Kelly. He's been averaging 9.5 fantasy points over the last 2 weeks. But like we said, first week he really didn't get a ton of touches until late in the game. So that's kind of miscued. RB22 is Alexander Madison, and I wanted to push him lower. You just get to these points and you just just need guys that are going to get touches. And Alexander Mattison is going to get touches. Now, is Ty Chandler going to start to get more touches with how bad Alexander Madison's been looking? Potentially 9.1 fantasy points. Los Angeles Chargers. Okay matchup for Alexander Mattison, but I'm not super excited. Just excited about the volume. We move on to our RB23, and we got Jerome Ford versus the Tennessee Titans. So the matchup looks great, but today it just, of course, came out that Kareem Hunt is getting signed to the team. And Jerome Ford, as much as I think Jerome Ford is more explosive than Kareem Hunt, you got to look at the money. $4 million in incentives for Kareem Hunt. That is pretty much starter running back money. I think Kareem Hunt's going to be the starter eventually. That doesn't mean that this week cannot still provide some value for Jerome Ford. So if I have Jerome Ford and I have him in quite a few lineups where I have injuries at other running backs, I will definitely be starting Jerome Ford. But Jerome Ford is my RB23 heading into this week, and we're definitely going to have to see what those splits look like next week. I think this week Kareem Hunt's joining the team. He'll probably get in the game still, but next week I think it's going to be a lot more indicative. And if Kareem Hunt comes in and absolutely just steals Jerome Ford's lunch, I think we then know what happens. So if you spend a lot of fab on Jerome Ford, I am sorry. I'm a little bit nervous about Jerome Ford currently right now. RB24 is going to be Dameon Pierce. We've been pushing Dameon Pierce. We've been pushing Dameon Pierce, but he hasn't been the absolute bell cow that we thought he was going to be. 6.1 fantasy points last 2 weeks average going up against Jacksonville Jaguars defense. Just not going to be a good matchup here for Dameon Pierce. Like we said, he's going to get touches. Can he score a touchdown? He hasn't been able to do that yet. Dameon Pierce as our RB24. RB25 is going to be Javonte. Same as that thing. Samaje Perine, Javonte, they've been really splitting touches there for Denver. Russ finally started looking like he was able to cook this last week, but 8.8 fantasy points average the last 2 weeks just isn't going to get it done for you on a week-by-week basis. Going up against the Miami Dolphins defense, they are underdogs very significantly. The Denver Broncos are, so I'm a little bit worried about Javonte. We then move into our F tier, and we just got a bunch of guys. We got Justice Hill and Gussie Boy Edwards versus the Indianapolis Colts. Just put both of them there. I think Gus Edwards is the back to own in Baltimore right now, but Justice Hill did look good last week. We then have Isaiah Pacheco versus Chicago Bears, 8.7 fantasy points average. It's not great. It's just not great for Isaiah Pacheco. Hasn't been getting the absolute bell cow status that we wanted out of the Chiefs backfield. You then have Matt Breida. We threw Matt Breida in RB29, got an upside shot. We don't like the matchup at all versus San Francisco's defense, but we do like Matt Breida's speed, and so we'll put him here at RB29. He's going to be the starter, going to be getting touches. Back end RB3 for you this week. We then have Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson. Roschon Johnson looks like the back you want to own for the Chicago Bears. We've been saying it all offseason that Roschon Johnson, with his blocking ability, is going to get on the field, and you let a man like that's explosive, that's a rookie onto the field, he's going to see touches. Roschon Johnson, Khalil Herbert here back to back. I think Khalil Herbert's still the starter, but Roschon Johnson just looks a lot more explosive. So in a pinch, I would have to start one of them if I had him on my team and I was absolutely desperate, but I would prefer to start Roschon, of course, over Khalil Herbert, if that's your personal opinion, but I have Khalil Herbert earlier because he is the starter. Now, then we end off with the two Jets running backs. We have Breece Hall and Dalvin Cook, and it's just been abysmal. Breece Hall last week not getting the touches. I think they're trying to bring him back a lot more slowly, especially with Aaron Rodgers being out. I think their title hopes are a little bit gone, so they want to make sure, let's bring our guy that got an ACL tear last year back very slowly. But then Dalvin Cook's looked absolutely abysmal, terrible. I don't know what to do with Dalvin Cook, honestly, but you have to put him here because he's going to be getting the touches for the New York Jets offense. So those are my tiers, and I know I got this comment last week saying, Caleb, please, at the end of the video, could you please put all the tiers? So here are all the tiers this week for my week 3 running backs. Appreciate you so much for tuning in here today. If you haven't already, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. We'll be back again tomorrow with another video. Appreciate you guys for tuning in here today, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.